There are few things more beautiful than an English village at Christmas time, and none more deceptive. Underneath the glittering frost and gentle carols, human hearts still beat with envy, ambition, fear, and folly. Miss Jane Marple knew this truth better than anyone, and though she smiled politely at the holly wreaths and twinkling candles of St. Mary Mead, she had long since learned that sin could wear the face of virtue and murder could hide behind a mince pie. It was the 23rd of December, and the village of Little Darning, a place not unlike St. Mary Mead, though smaller and perhaps even more inclined to gossip, was preparing for its annual Christmas Eve festivities. The great manor, Haverley Hall, stood proudly on the rise beyond the churchyard, its Georgian windows framed by ivy and its chimneys releasing elegant curls of smoke into the pale afternoon sky. Inside, the servants were in a flurry of activity, polishing silver, trimming garlands, and preparing the grand dining table for the upcoming feast. This year, the party promised to be particularly memorable, for Colonel Arthur Redmayne, master of Haverley Hall and one of the most respected gentlemen in the county, had returned from his long absence in India. He was to host a Christmas Eve supper that would reunite some of the village's most prominent residents, and, as fate would have it, Miss Marple herself was among the invited guests. The invitation had come rather unexpectedly. Colonel Redmayne had been a friend of Miss Marple's late nephew, and upon learning that she was staying with a friend in the neighbouring village of Much Benham for the season, he had written her a cordial note. "My dear Miss Marple, you must do us the honour of joining our Christmas Eve gathering. I am told you possess a mind most attuned to observation. Perhaps you can help us keep our guests in good order. Yours sincerely, Arthur Redmayne." Miss Marple had smiled when she received it. Keep them in good order. Indeed! That was precisely what she often found herself doing, though few ever realized it until too late. The guests of Haverley Hall by dusk. The first guests had already begun to arrive. Snow had begun to fall, soft, delicate flakes that clung to the branches like lace, and the lanterns along the drive flickered warmly against the growing darkness. Inside the grand drawing-room, a fire crackled cheerfully, casting a golden glow upon the polished mahogany and velvet curtains. A Christmas tree, tall and dignified, stood in the corner, bedecked with ribbons, glass ornaments, and dozens of hand-cut paper angels made by the local children. Beneath it, parcels of various shapes and sizes hinted at the generosity of their host. Colonel Redmayne, a tall, broad man in his late 50s with a bristling moustache and the kind of firm handshake one associates with old military stock, greeted each arrival with booming good humor. His wife, Mrs. Constance Redmayne, was a gentle creature, nervous, pale, and perpetually clutching a lace handkerchief. She was kind to everyone, yet seemed to shrink from her husband's hearty manner. Among the assembled guests were several figures of note: Dr. Lionel Ferris, the village physician, a man of science and precision, whose cold grey eyes missed nothing; Mrs. Eliza Kent, the Colonel's widowed sister, sharp-tongued and opinionated, with an unfortunate taste for sherry and scandal; Mr. Julian Ashcroft, a visiting artist lodging in the village, known for his charming manners and reputation for painting portraits of the soul; Miss Nora Bentley, the young companion to Mrs. Redmayne, a demure, pretty girl with anxious eyes and an air of quiet desperation; Reverend Tobias Chalmers, the local vicar, stout and kindly, though somewhat absent-minded when not engaged in moral discourse; and finally Mr. Henry Copley, a solicitor from London, rumoured to have business dealings with the Colonel involving an inheritance dispute. It was, Miss Marple reflected, an excellent collection of human nature, just the sort of gathering where observation proved endlessly instructive, an uneasy supper-dinner that evening was served with great ceremony. The silver gleamed, the candles flickered, and the servants moved with the quiet efficiency that spoke of well-trained staff. Yet beneath the surface of joviality, Miss Marple sensed a curious tension. The Colonel presided at the head of the table, carving roast goose and recounting stories of his days in the Punjab, while his wife smiled faintly and said little. Dr. Ferris watched her keenly from across the table, too keenly, Miss Marple thought. Mrs. Kent, on the other hand, made little effort to disguise her dislike for nearly everyone present, though her criticisms were always delivered with a smile so saccharine it could curdle cream. At one point, Miss Marple observed the young companion, Miss Nora Bentley, fumble her glass of wine. The Colonel's eyes narrowed sharply. "Careful, my dear," he said with deceptive calm. "We can't afford clumsiness in this house." The girl flushed deeply and murmured an apology, her hands trembling as she dabbed at the tablecloth. It was a small thing, perhaps, but to Miss Marple it was a note in a melody, one discordant and telling. A toast and a warning when the plum pudding arrived, aflame and fragrant. The Colonel rose to his feet to propose a toast. "To old friends and new beginnings," he declared, "and to the peace and goodwill that this blessed season brings." Everyone raised their glasses, yet Miss Marple could not help noticing that Mrs. Redmayne's hand trembled so violently that a drop of wine fell onto her lace sleeve. Dr. Ferris leaned closer, whispering something under his breath. Whatever he said made her eyes widen in distress. After dinner, the guests gathered in the drawing-room for coffee and carols. Miss Marple, sitting quietly by the fire with her knitting, observed the room as she always did, without appearing to do so. The Colonel seemed unusually jovial, laughing loudly with Mr. Ashcroft, though the artist's smile was thin and his gaze distant. Mrs. Kent was deep in conversation with the vicar, who appeared to be enduring rather than enjoying her company. Miss Nora Bentley sat alone at the piano, her fingers tracing idle notes, her expression wistful. Miss Marple caught a fleeting glance between Mrs. Redmayne and the young companion, a look of understanding, of shared fear. It was gone in an instant, but it told her something important, that both women were afraid of something or someone. The first murder at precisely 9:30, the storm began in earnest. Snow fell heavily, muffling the sound of the church bells and cloaking the manor in a serene, almost holy silence. The wind whistled through the eaves, and the guests began speaking of retiring early. It was at that moment that the butler, an elderly man named Simmons, entered the room pale and shaken. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said hoarsely, "but there's been an accident, down in the library." The Colonel's brow furrowed. "An accident? What the devil do you mean?" Simmons swallowed hard. "It's Mr. Copley, sir. I found him slumped over the desk. I think he's dead." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Redmayne let out a faint cry, while Mrs. Kent clutched her pearls with melodramatic horror. Dr. Ferris immediately strode from the room, Miss Marple following quietly behind him. The library was a handsome room, lined with books and panelled in oak, with a large desk at its centre. Mr. Copley sat slumped forward, his face resting against a sheaf of papers, an overturned glass beside him. The smell of brandy hung faintly in the air. Dr. Ferris bent to examine the body. After a moment, he straightened and said grimly, "He's dead. Looks like heart failure." But he paused. "There's something odd here." Miss Marple, who had been studying the desk, nodded gently. "Yes," she said softly, "very odd indeed. People don't generally spill brandy over a document they are reading, unless they're interrupted." The Colonel frowned. "Are you suggesting foul play, Miss Marple?" She looked up at him mildly, her knitting still in her hands. "I never suggest, Colonel. I merely observe, but I think it might be wise to send for Inspector Graves." Whispers in the snow. by the time Inspector Graves arrived from the nearby town of Barchester, the storm had worsened. The roads were nearly impassable, and the telephone lines had begun to fail. It was clear that no one would be leaving Haverley Hall that night. The inspector, a sensible man with a calm manner, examined the scene and agreed that the death was suspicious. The glass from which Mr. Copley had been drinking was sent to the kitchen for testing. Dr. Ferris volunteered to assist, though Miss Marple noticed that his eagerness seemed tinged with something else, perhaps an anxiety to control what might be discovered. Later, in the drawing-room, the guests gathered once more, subdued and uneasy. The fire crackled, the clock ticked solemnly, and outside the snow continued to fall in heavy silence. "I can't believe it," Mrs. Kent murmured. "Poor Mr. Copley, to die like that, and on Christmas Eve too." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Christmas, my dear Mrs. Kent, is no barrier to mischief. Indeed, I've always thought it an especially dangerous time, when passions are heightened, tempers fray, and secrets find themselves inconveniently near to discovery." Mrs. Kent gave her a startled look. "You mean, you think it was murder?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think, Mrs. Kent, that someone in this room knows more than they care to admit." At that, the conversation died, and for a long moment, the only sound was the wind rattling against the window panes. A hint of scandal as the night deepened. The inspector questioned each guest in turn. From her seat near the fire, Miss Marple quietly knitted and listened. She had long ago discovered that people reveal more when they believe themselves unobserved. Dr. Ferris claimed he had been in the conservatory, checking on Mrs. Redmayne, who had felt faint after dinner. Mrs. Kent said she had been in her room, writing letters. Mr. Ashcroft confessed to taking a short walk in the snow for inspiration. And Miss Nora Bentley hesitated, saying she had gone upstairs to fetch her shawl, yet her eyes betrayed uncertainty, as though she could not quite recall what had happened. Miss Marple took note of them all, particularly of Mrs. Redmayne, who seemed on the verge of tears. The poor woman's hands twisted restlessly in her lap. When questioned, she insisted that she had been in her room reading, but the tremor in her voice made it plain she was lying. It was a curious situation indeed. A solicitor dead, apparently poisoned, in a room filled with documents concerning an inheritance. A nervous wife, a bitter sister, a secretive companion, an artist, and a doctor with altogether too much interest in his patient's affairs. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. There was, she reflected, more beneath the surface of this household than met the eye, and though the snow might isolate them from the world, human nature would reveal itself sooner or later. Foreshadowing the storm to come as the clock struck midnight, the guests were finally sent to their rooms. The body was laid out in the small morning room, and the inspector set a watch by the door. Yet Miss Marple, ever cautious, could not sleep. She sat by her window, watching the snow swirl across the gardens, her mind gently sifting through what she had seen and heard. A heart attack, the doctor had said, but healthy men in their 40s did not simply collapse after sipping brandy, not unless the brandy concealed something deadly. She recalled the faint bitterness in the air, the anxiety of Mrs. Redmayne, the tremor of Miss Bentley's hands, the calculating eyes of Dr. Ferris. Human nature. She murmured to herself, "It never changes." Somewhere downstairs, a door creaked softly. A shadow passed across the snow, and in the stillness of that wintry night, Miss Marple felt the first chill of understanding, a whisper of what was to come. For though one man already lay dead at Haverley Hall, before dawn broke over Little Darning, there would be two more. Morning broke grey and bleak over Little Darning, the world outside Haverley Hall blanketed in deep snow. The great house, so festive the evening before, now seemed cloaked in solemn stillness. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys, and the faint tolling of the church bell drifted across the frozen fields, a reminder that even Christmas Eve could dawn upon tragedy. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and looked out from her window upon the courtyard below. The snow lay unbroken except for a few sets of footprints, those of the constable who had stood watch by the library through the night. She thought quietly as she dressed, her mind already busy at work. The death of Mr. Henry Copley, the solicitor, was a puzzle that did not fit the ordinary patterns of accident or natural cause. There were too many small contradictions, too many little things, as she would have said, that didn't sit comfortably in her mind. At 8 o'clock, the household gathered in the breakfast room, subdued and uneasy. The Colonel looked grim, Mrs. Redmayne pale as parchment. Mrs. Kent complained bitterly that her appetite was ruined. Dr. Ferris, looking brisk and professional, murmured that the police would wish to speak with everyone again. The young companion, Nora Bentley, avoided everyone's eyes. "It's unthinkable," the Colonel declared, pushing aside his plate. "A death like that under my roof, and at Christmas. By heavens, I won't have gossip spread about Haverley Hall." "Gossip," murmured Miss Marple softly from her corner, "has a most inconvenient way of existing even when discouraged, Colonel. It does not require fuel, only curiosity." The Colonel frowned at her. "You think someone in this house, my dear Colonel," she interrupted gently, "I think someone here knows rather more than they've said. Whether that amounts to guilt is quite another matter." Inspector Graves returns. Inspector Graves appeared soon after breakfast, his boots heavy with snow, his expression serious. He was a practical man, thick-set, fair-haired, with a steady gaze that impressed confidence. He had spent most of the night in the small village constabulary, trying to contact the coroner and the regional pathologist, though the storm had made all communication difficult. "We'll have to manage what we can until the weather clears," he said gravely. "For now, no one leaves the hall." The Colonel bristled. "Surely that's unnecessary." "It's necessary, sir." Graves interrupted firmly. "A man's died here, and we've reason to believe he was poisoned. Until we're sure who did it, no one goes out and nothing leaves this house." The statement was met with uneasy silence. Mrs. Redmayne's teacup clattered softly against its saucer. Nora Bentley went pale. Mrs. Kent opened her mouth as if to protest, then shut it again. Miss Marple, who had resumed her knitting, merely nodded. "A very sensible precaution, Inspector. Snow, after all, makes such an excellent barrier to escape." Graves turned to her with a faint smile. "You've an observant eye, Miss Marple. I hear you've helped the police once or twice before." "Oh, not helped," she said modestly. "Just noticed. You see, human nature is much the same whether in St. Mary Mead or London, or Haverley Hall." The inspector inclined his head politely. "Then perhaps you'll forgive me if I don't mind you noticing a bit more while I do my rounds, of course," said Miss Marple serenely. "I should be most delighted." The scene revisited together, they went to the library. The fire had long since gone cold. The curtains were still drawn, the air faint with the smell of extinguished candle wax and brandy. The desk stood exactly as it had been the night before, except that the body was gone. Inspector Graves gestured to the papers strewn across the blotter. Legal documents, a will, apparently. The Colonel's late brother left some property in Ceylon, now India, and this Mr. Copley was handling the claim. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, scanning the top sheet delicately. Yes, I thought as much. An inheritance. 'S always an awkward subject in families. I remember a similar case in St. Mary Mead when old Mr. Pritchard died and left everything to the niece who watered his roses." The inspector smiled faintly. "You think money's the motive?" "Money," she said gently, is a very dull motive, Inspector. It is nearly always something else behind it. Pride, jealousy, resentment, or fear. Money is simply the excuse. She pointed toward the desk. That glass, for instance, it wasn't refilled. Mr. Copley must have poured it himself. Yet the decanter shows signs of being handled afterwards. A small smudge on the stopper. Someone poured again after he'd fallen. Graves raised an eyebrow. Meaning, said Miss Marple, that our murderer is not above tidying their scene. Suspect no. 1. The Colonel Inspector Graves began his formal interviews later that morning, and Miss Marple, under the pretext of serving tea, managed to overhear much of what transpired. The first to be called was Colonel Redmayne. The Colonel was indignant, naturally. Poison, you say? Ridiculous. The man was a heavy drinker. It's more likely his heart gave out. Perhaps, said Graves mildly. But you had business dealings with him. Yes, perfectly above board. Copley was handling the transfer of property from my late brother's estate. A tiresome business. He was to bring me certain papers last night. Drafts, legal nonsense. And you discussed them. Briefly, he said he'd drawn up a revised version, then went to the library to make notes. That's the last I saw of him. Graves scribbled something in his notebook. Were you on good terms? Good terms? The Colonel bristled. I hardly knew the fellow. Efficient, but unpleasant. Smug sort of man. Thought too highly of himself. Miss Marple, listening from the doorway, noted the faint quiver in the Colonel's voice when he spoke. Not fear exactly, but restraint. An effort to keep something in check. Suspect no. 2. Mrs. Constance Redmayne. Next came Mrs. Redmayne. The poor woman looked frail as she entered, her eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. Her hands twisted her handkerchief into tight knots as she sat. This is dreadful, she murmured, truly dreadful. You knew Mr. Copley well? Asked Graves. He came often about the estate. My husband thought him efficient. I found him unsettling. Unsettling how? He once made remarks that I found improper. Her face colored faintly. Nothing overt, you understand. But he hinted that if I wished to secure my husband's interests, I might persuade him to sign certain papers. Miss Marple's eyes flicked upward sharply. That, she thought, was most interesting indeed. Did you tell your husband? No, I didn't want to cause trouble. Arthur has a temper, you see. And where were you last night at the time of his death? In my room, reading. I heard nothing until Simmons came running. Graves nodded, but Miss Marple saw the small tremor of nerves that betrayed the woman's fear. She pitied her, but pity, she knew, was dangerous in cases such as these. It softened the edges of logic. Suspect no. 3. Dr. Lionel Ferris. Dr. Ferris appeared perfectly composed. He sat straight, backed, his expression cool. I examined the body, as you know. He said crisply, the signs point to heart failure, though if you suspect poison, you'll need a proper analysis. You were friendly with Mr. Copley? Graves asked. Not particularly. He consulted me once about insomnia. I prescribed bromide, though I doubt he used it. And you were in the conservatory last night? Yes, Mrs. Redmayne fainted after dinner. I fetched her smelling salts and ensured she was resting comfortably. You seem very attentive to Mrs. Redmayne's welfare, said the inspector dryly. A faint smile curved the doctor's lips. She's my patient. From her seat near the door, Miss Marple thought. Yes, but not only your patient, I fancy. She had seen too many cases where sympathy disguised affection, and affection in turn disguised desperation. Suspect no. 4. Mrs. Eliza Kent. Mrs. Kent swept in, her pearls rattling faintly, her perfume preceding her like a battle standard. I suppose we must all play our parts, she said acidly. It's perfectly monstrous, of course. I told Arthur that inviting outsiders at Christmas was simply asking for trouble. You disliked Mr. Copley? Graves inquired. Disliked him, I despised him, a sly man, one of those who pries into family affairs and pretends it's his duty. He hinted once that my late brother's will had been tampered with, as if I'd care a farthing for the Redmayne estate. Miss Marple looked down at her knitting, hiding a smile. People who declared their indifference too forcefully were often the most interested of all. Suspect no. 5. Nora Bentley. When Nora Bentley entered, the atmosphere softened. She was young, fragile, with the kind of innocence that tempts protection. Yet Miss Marple knew well that innocence can be armor, just as shyness can conceal resolve. Miss Bentley, said Graves gently, you were Mrs. Redmayne's companion. Yes, sir. And where were you last night? Upstairs in my room. I went there after coffee. Did you hear anything unusual? Only voices, I think. Mr. Copley and the Colonel talking rather loudly. Graves leaned forward. You're sure of that? Quite sure, sir. A flicker of alarm crossed the Colonel's face across the room. Miss Marple noted it instantly. So they did argue, she thought, and the girl remembers it clearly. Anything else? Nora hesitated, then whispered, when I came down later to fetch my shawl, the library light was still on. I saw someone leaving, but I couldn't tell who. They were wearing a dark coat. A man's coat. I think so, sir. Her eyes darted nervously toward Dr. Ferris, then quickly away. Miss Marple's quiet watch that afternoon. The household remained confined indoors. The snow still fell heavily, the wind sighing through the chimneys. Inspector Graves was occupied with telegrams and notes, but Miss Marple, apparently absorbed in her knitting, moved quietly from room to room, her eyes taking in every detail. She paused by the conservatory, where a faint scent of medicinal spirits lingered. On the small side table lay a cut-glass vial marked Digitalis. Curious, she murmured, for a lady with a strong heart. She found Dr. Ferris nearby, adjusting his gloves. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said pleasantly. "You're up early to your rounds. Only a little walk." She smiled. "Such dreadful weather, though I must say, I do envy doctors, always so calm when the rest of us are fluttering about." "One learns to be calm, Miss Marple." "Yes," she said, watching him closely. "One learns when one has much to hide." The doctor's hand froze on the doorknob for the briefest instant, then he smiled thinly. "You're a shrewd lady, Miss Marple." "Oh, dear me, not shrewd at all," she said sweetly. "Merely old." A second death. It was just after luncheon that the second tragedy struck. Mrs. Kent had retired to her room for a necessary rest, as she called it. When Simmons went to call her an hour later, he found the door locked. After repeated knocking brought no answer, the door was forced open, and there she lay, lifeless upon the bed, her face ashen, a small glass bottle clutched in her hand. Dr. Ferris examined the body quickly. "Chloral," he said grimly, "an overdose, suicide, no doubt." But Miss Marple, standing quietly by the dressing-table, shook her head. "No, doctor, I don't think so." I mean, she said softly, "that our murderer has struck again." She lifted a lace handkerchief from the floor. Upon it was a faint smear of powder, white, crystalline. Mrs. Kent was fond of cosmetics, she said, but not of this kind. Someone wished to silence her, and they've succeeded. Inspector Graves swore under his breath. 2 deaths in 24 hours. Whoever's behind this means business. Miss Marple nodded gravely. "Indeed. But you see, Inspector, there's one advantage to such determination." "What's that?" "It always leads them to make one mistake too many." The pattern emerges as evening fell. The storm at last began to ease. The villagers below could see the faint glow of lights from the hall. unaware of the grim drama unfolding within its walls. Miss Marple sat once more in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly. Around her, the remaining guests moved in subdued fear. Mrs. Redmayne stared into the fire, her husband pacing the carpet like a caged lion. Dr. Ferris sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the flames. Nora Bentley trembled silently in a corner. 3 deaths before Christmas, murmured Miss Marple under her breath, or perhaps only 2, for now. The Colonel stopped pacing. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" She looked up at him mildly. "I mean that the pattern is not yet complete. Whoever killed Mr. Copley and Mrs. Kent will kill again before morning, unless we stop them." A stunned silence followed. The clock on the mantel struck 8, each chime echoing through the room like a warning. Miss Marple's eyes glinted in the firelight. "And I think, Colonel, that before this Christmas Eve is over, we shall know exactly who and why." The storm had at last retreated into a sullen drizzle, leaving Haverley Hall wrapped in damp mist and dread. The clock struck 8, and yet it might as well have been midnight, for every corridor seemed steeped in shadow. 2 bodies now lay in the morning room: Mr. Copley, the poisoned solicitor, and Mrs. Kent, the unfortunate sister whose suicide no one any longer believed. Fear clung to the house like a second layer of frost. Miss Marple sat quietly by the library hearth, knitting, her needles moving with calm precision. It was the picture of domestic tranquillity, save that her eyes, bright as the flame before her, missed nothing. She had lived long enough to know that murder, like measles, seldom stops at one victim. 3 murders, she murmured softly, the patterns in the title, as it were. Inspector Graves entered, his coat still damp. "You've a grim sort of humour, Miss Marple." "Merely realistic, Inspector. Our culprit is not yet done. One more life will balance whatever account they imagine they're keeping. Aye." Motives entwined. Graves laid out his findings on the desk. 2 cups, a decanter, Mrs. Kent's perfume bottle, and several sheets of correspondence taken from Mr. Copley's attaché case. "It seems," he said, Copley had drafted 2 wills for the late Major Redmayne, one naming the Colonel's sole heir, another dividing the estate between him and Mrs. Kent. Only the Colonel and Copley knew which was valid. Miss Marple nodded. "And now both Copley and Mrs. Kent are dead. How very tidy. You suspect the Colonel?" "I never suspect, Inspector," she said mildly. "I consider probabilities. The Colonel is proud. Too proud, perhaps, to risk scandal, but pride may kill as easily as greed." Graves frowned. Still, Ferris had access to poison. So he did, and an emotional motive, which is often the most dangerous kind. She folded her knitting into her lap. "You see, Dr. Ferris is in love with Mrs. Redmayne. That much is plain. But he is also frightened of exposure. A man who mixes affection with fear becomes capable of foolish, desperate things. You've noticed more in 2 days than I in 20 years. Graves muttered. "Only because I've spent those years among tea parties, village fêtes, and sewing circles," she replied serenely. "Human nature is the same everywhere. Only the setting changes." Roman 2. A conversation in the garden room later that evening. Miss Marple found Mrs. Redmayne in the garden room, gazing out into the fog where icicles hung like crystal daggers. The poor woman's hands trembled on the window ledge. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you mustn't stand in this chill." Mrs. Redmayne turned. "Oh, Miss Marple, I can hardly breathe in that drawing room. Arthur's temper, this dreadful business. If I could only go away. But you cannot, not yet." Miss Marple's voice was kind but firm. "Tell me, why did you lie to the inspector about last night?" The woman started. "Lie? You said you were in your room reading, but Nora Bentley saw you come from the corridor leading to the library." Tears filled her eyes. "I only went to speak to Mr. Copley. He threatened me. Threatened you. He knew about the will. He said he could ruin Arthur if I didn't. She broke off, shivering. He wanted money, and when I refused, he laughed. I ran away. Oh, Miss Marple, do you think I killed him? No, my dear, said Miss Marple softly. You haven't the sort of mind that plans a death. But someone overheard that quarrel and made use of it. From the doorway came a faint creak. Miss Marple turned quickly, but the shadow had vanished. Only the echo of a departing step remained. You see, she murmured, walls in country houses have remarkably good ears. Roman 3. Nora's secret when Miss Marple found Nora Bentley. The girl was in the nursery folding linen. A strange occupation for a Christmas Eve, yet her hands moved feverishly, as though occupation could smother panic. My dear, said Miss Marple, you remind me of young Polly Hargreaves in St. Mary Mead. She always dusted when she'd something to hide. Nora flushed. I've nothing to hide, ma'am. Then perhaps you can help me understand why Mrs. Redmayne's jewel case lies empty. The girl's eyes widened. Empty? Quite, and it was you who fetched it from the strong room yesterday morning. Nora twisted her fingers. Mrs. Redmayne asked me to. She meant to sell one of her brooches to pay Mr. Copley, but when I took the case later to her room, it was lighter. Something was gone. A diamond pendant. Yes, I thought perhaps she had sold it already. Miss Marple sighed. So now we have blackmail and theft. It grows complicated, doesn't it? I didn't tell the inspector, Nora whispered. I was afraid he'd blame her. Silence is dangerous, child, said Miss Marple kindly. It protects the wrong person 9 times out of 10. Roman 4. The colonel loses his temper by late afternoon. Tension had risen like steam. The colonel's booming voice could be heard through half the house. I'll not have my wife interrogated again, Graves. She's unwell, and this prying old woman, he glared at Miss Marple, has filled her head with nonsense. Colonel, Miss Marple replied calmly, nonsense has its uses. It often makes people careless in contradiction. Meaning what? Meaning that your wife never mentioned giving Copley any papers, yet his briefcase contained one bearing your signature, dated yesterday. The colonel's face purpled. He must have forged it. Or you signed it earlier than you recall, said Graves. We'll need handwriting verification. You'll have nothing of mine. The colonel struck the table. I've cooperated enough. He stormed out, slamming the door. Miss Marple resumed her knitting serenely. A temper like that, she said, is often followed by apology, or by blood. False Trail's evening crept in again, and the house seemed to shrink under its weight. Graves's men searched rooms. The servants whispered that the hall was cursed. Every discovery produced another tangle. In the pantry they found a bottle of brandy, half empty, with traces of digitalis, the same medicine Dr. Ferris had prescribed to another patient weeks before. Yet Ferris swore it was stolen from his bag. Then came Simmons, the butler, pale as parchment. Beg pardon, sir, he told Graves, but the side door keys missing. The inspector muttered a curse. So much for no one leaving the house. On the contrary, said Miss Marple, it means someone pretended to leave. The key is a diversion. Our murderer is fond of drama. She remembered suddenly Mrs. Kent's lace handkerchief, the crystalline dust upon it. Powdered sugar mixed with poison, perhaps, a woman's touch. Yet the pattern was too deliberate, too theatrical. Red herrings, she thought. They always smell strongest when the truth is near. A dangerous walk after supper. A joyless meal eaten in near silence. Miss Marple wrapped her shawl about her shoulders and asked Nora to accompany her to the chapel at the end of the west wing. The girl hesitated. It's cold and dark, ma'am. Yes, dear. But sometimes darkness is useful. It makes hidden lights easier to see. They crossed the long corridor, the air heavy with the scent of pine and polish. Candles flickered before the little altar. Beyond the frosted glass, the snow gleamed faintly blue. So peaceful, whispered Nora. Peace often comes after confession, said Miss Marple. Is there something you wish to tell me before someone else does? Nora burst into tears. It was Dr. Ferris. I saw him leaving Mrs. Kent's room after everyone went to bed. He told me she'd been taken ill, but when I offered to fetch help, he forbade it. And you obeyed. I was terrified. He said he'd ruin me, that he knew about the missing jewels. Miss Marple patted her arm gently. There. You've been foolish, not wicked. But we must be careful. Desperate men do not sleep quietly. Romans 7. The third murder at 10:30, the hall was struck by another cry. High, short, and dreadful. It came from the east landing. By the time Graves and Miss Marple arrived, the door of the small study was ajar, and a faint trail of candle smoke drifted into the corridor. On the rug lay Dr. Lionel Ferris, face downward, a revolver near his hand. The smell of cordite stung the air. Suicide again, murmured Graves bitterly. Miss Marple knelt beside the body. No inspector. Look, the pistol's on the wrong side. He was left-handed. Indeed, the weapon lay by the right, and on the desk, half hidden by scattered papers, was a small envelope addressed to Mrs. Constance Redmayne. Graves slid it open. Inside was a single sheet, scrawled hastily, "Forgive me. I can bear it no longer. I did not mean for her to die." "A confession," said Graves grimly. "A forgery," said Miss Marple. "Observe the ink still wet, yet the hand trembles unnaturally. Someone forced him to write, or wrote it for him. Our murderer has completed the trilogy." Roman 8. Piecing the puzzle later, in the silent library, Miss Marple and the inspector reviewed the grim procession. 3 deaths, Graves said wearily. Copley, Kent, Ferris. 1 poison, 1 overdose, 1 pistol. 3 different methods, 3 opportunities, but what single motive could tie them? Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. The same motive that ties most tragedies, Inspector, self-preservation. You mean someone killing to cover their tracks? Precisely. Copley threatened exposure. Mrs. Kent discovered proof. Ferris guessed the truth. Each was removed in turn. Graves leaned forward, and who remains with both opportunity and fear enough to drive them to it. Miss Marple lifted her eyes. Consider the simplest constant. Every victim dealt with the Colonel's affairs. Yet she held up a finger. That is too easy. The Colonel blusters, but he lacks subtlety. There is another hand, one that moves softly behind his shadow. His wife, perhaps, or perhaps one who appears to protect her. She rose. Come, Inspector, let us examine the Colonel's writing. Desk once more. There's something there that's been bothering me since yesterday. Roman 9. The hidden document. The desk yielded little at first. Pens, blotting paper, a few unpaid bills. But Miss Marple's eyes caught a corner of parchment wedged behind the drawer lining. With delicate fingers she drew it free. Oh, the missing original will. Graves whistled. And look, the signature, not the Colonel's at all. Indeed, the looping hand belonged unmistakably to Mrs. Redmayne. It was witnessed by Ferris and Copley. Miss Marple observed. That explains much. If this will came to light, the estate would pass to Mrs. Redmayne, not her husband. So Ferris helped her. Then Copley tried to blackmail, and someone silenced them both. She folded the document, but the hand that killed Mrs. Kent was different. Mrs. Redmayne is timid. She could not have managed chloral poisoning without help. Then who, think Inspector, who knew the household drugs, who could enter any room unnoticed, who worships the Colonel enough to protect his honor, yet fears his anger too much to confess? Graves stared. The companion. Exactly. X. The net tightens. Miss Marple requested that all remaining guests assemble in the drawing room. It was near midnight. The great clock ticked solemnly, and the air smelled faintly of pine and candle grease. Outside, the bells of Little Darning began to ring the first notes of Christmas Day. My dear friends, she began gently, we have endured a dreadful series of misfortunes. Yet truth, like the dawn, cannot be kept from rising. The Colonel grunted. Get on with it, madame. Very well. Mr. Copley was poisoned with digitalis placed in his brandy. The decanter shows two sets of prints, his own and Miss Nora Bentley's. Mrs. Kent was killed by the same hand that later forged Dr. Ferris's note. The handwriting matches, feminine, nervous, and small. Nora gasped. "No, I didn't. You did," said Miss Marple, not unkindly, but not out of hatred. "You thought you were protecting the Colonel. You believed Mr. Copley meant to expose him for fraud, and Mrs. Kent to ruin Mrs. Redmayne. When Dr. Ferris guessed the truth and threatened to tell the police, you panicked." The girl's face crumpled. "I only meant to frighten him. I loved them both, the Colonel and her ladyship. I wanted to save them." "Instead," said Miss Marple softly, "you destroyed them. The Colonel will stand trial for concealment, Mrs. Redmayne for forgery, but you, my dear, for 3 counts of murder." Nora sank to her knees, sobbing. The Colonel covered his face with his hands. Mrs. Redmayne fainted quietly into Graves's arms. Miss Marple folded her knitting once more, her expression sorrowful. "It is always the same," she murmured. "One begins with loyalty and ends with blood." Roman 11. Epilogue of the night. By the small hours the constables had taken the weeping girl away, and silence settled again over Haverley Hall. The snow had stopped. A thin moon hung above the frozen fields. Miss Marple stood by the tall window, watching the first grey blush of Christmas morning creep across the horizon. The bells rang out more clearly now, sweet, solemn, and strangely forgiving. Inspector Graves joined her. "You were right, of course. I should have seen it. The key, the forged note, the prints. You would have given time," she said kindly, "but time is an indulgence murderers seldom grant. Will you be leaving with the morning coach?" "Yes, there's a carol service at St. Mary Mead I should hate to miss." He smiled. "After all this, especially after this," said Miss Marple, "Christmas reminds us that even in the darkest winter, light returns. One mustn't let evil have the last word." She turned back to the fire, her needles resuming their quiet rhythm. Outside, the first sunbeam touched the snow-covered roof of Haverley Hall, and for a moment the world looked clean again, white, still, and forgiving. Morning at Haverley Hall dawned with a ghostly serenity that felt almost cruel. The snow had stopped, the air was glass, clear, and the faint chiming of distant church bells rolled over the frostbitten fields like a benediction. Yet inside the house, peace had not returned. The great Christmas tree in the drawing-room still stood, candles unlit, presents unopened. The once festive scent of pine and oranges seemed strangely hollow now, an echo of a celebration that would never come. Miss Marple, wrapped in her grey shawl, sat by the window of her guest-room with a notebook on her lap. Outside, a pair of robins flitted between the frosted hedgerows. She watched them, thoughtful and still, her mind turning over each detail of the past 2 days. 3 murders, she murmured softly, 3 opportunities, 3 lies, and 1 truth that binds them. Aye, shadows at daylight. Inspector Graves appeared not long after breakfast, his manner brisk but weary. "We've taken Miss Bentley to the station," he said. "She's confessed to everything, though whether she fully understood what she was doing is another matter." "Confession is a comfort to conscience," said Miss Marple gently, "but truth, Inspector, is rarely so simple. One must test confession as one tests silver, by the sound it makes when struck." Graves looked puzzled. "You think she's lying?" "Not lying precisely, but there's something missing. It's always the smallest thing, you see, the sort of thing most people overlook. A cup, a button, a letter, and here, something was taken before every death, something oddly sentimental." Graves frowned. "Taken?" "Yes, from Copley. A gold cufflink engraved with initials. From Mrs. Kent. A locket with a miniature of her brother. From Dr. Ferris. A signet ring. Not items of value, but keepsakes. What murderer collects mementos? Not Nora, surely. She was too frightened, too impulsive." The inspector's brows rose. "You're saying someone else committed the murders?" I'm saying someone guided her hand, Miss Marple replied quietly, a mind colder and older than hers. Roman 2. The Colonel's collapse in the study. Colonel Redmayne sat slumped in an armchair, staring into the ashes of last night's fire. His face, once ruddy and commanding, had turned a sallow grey. His hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. "They tell me Nora has confessed," he said hoarsely when Miss Marple entered. "A stupid girl. Always too fond of my wife, and of you," Miss Marple added mildly. The Colonel's head jerked up. "Nonsense." "Oh, it happens," she said. "A young woman serving in a household often attaches herself emotionally to those she admires. It makes her blind, and willing to do dreadful things in the name of loyalty." He puffed smoke toward the window. "You make it sound as though I encouraged it." "Did you?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then looked away. "I may have been friendly. She reminded me of my daughter before the war. I never meant harm." "I'm sure you didn't," said Miss Marple. "But kindness misread can become the seed of tragedy." She rose, glancing toward the mantelpiece. "May I ask, Colonel, where your wife is?" "In her room, under the doctor's care. She's not well enough for questions." "Then perhaps," said Miss Marple, "you will answer one for her. Why was the forged will hidden in your desk, yet signed by her hand?" The Colonel's jaw tightened. "Because she was a fool," he said suddenly. "She wanted to protect me from debts, from scandal. Copley said it was the only way, and now, look what it's brought." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly. But the handwriting was not hers alone. The witnesses were convenient, both dead now, and someone else filled in the missing lines. Who? "That," said Miss Marple, "is what I mean to find out." Roman 3. Miss Marple's hypothesis at luncheon. Miss Marple sat with Inspector Graves, sketching her deductions in that delicate, almost apologetic tone she used when revealing uncomfortable truths. "Let us consider each death as a scene in a play," she began. "First, Mr. Copley, he was poisoned during supper. The brandy was tampered with, yes, but the glass he used came from the sideboard, not the tray. And who fetched it? Simmons, the butler." "Precisely. Yet Simmons was later seen in the cellar, fetching more wine. Someone else poured the brandy in his absence. Someone who knew Copley would drink alone after the others had gone to bed." Graves nodded slowly. "You think the Colonel—" No, he'd have confronted Copley openly. Pride would forbid anything underhand, but his wife, she is quiet, gentle, and frightened, the perfect mask, except she lacks the nerve for murder. I suspect she was persuaded." Graves frowned. "Persuaded by whom?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "By someone who has lived long in the shadows of this house. Someone who knows the family's secrets better than any guest or servant. Someone who has served here since before the war." The inspector's eyes widened. "Simmons." "Not Simmons," she corrected. "His sister." The housekeeper, Mrs. Hargreaves. Roman 4. The housekeeper's tale. Mrs. Hargreaves was a formidable woman, tall, broad-shouldered, with hair pulled so tight it gave her face an almost polished look. She stood in the servants' hall like a matron of discipline, her keys jangling at her waist. Miss Marple entered quietly, carrying her knitting bag. "You've been here long, Mrs. Hargreaves." 27 years, ma'am, since before the late Major passed. A faithful record." "You must have known the Colonel since he was quite young." "Knew him when he was a wild lad, yes," she said curtly. "Always the pride of the family." Miss Marple smiled. "And pride can be hard to see destroyed, can't it?" "Hard enough to make one do foolish things, terrible things, even in the name of love." Mrs. Hargreaves' mouth tightened. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," Miss Marple said gently. "It was you who found the letter from Copley, wasn't it? The one threatening to expose the Colonel's gambling debts." You who advised Mrs. Redmayne to keep it quiet." The woman's eyes flickered. She came to me crying. I only told her to burn it. And yet it wasn't burned. It was kept in your desk. Mrs. Hargreaves' face drained of colour. "You've been through my things." "No, my dear, the inspector's men have. You see, the truth always hides in the place we think safest." There was silence, heavy and electric. At last, the housekeeper spoke in a low voice. He was going to ruin the Colonel. Copley, that filthy little man. He meant to drag the family name through the mud. I couldn't let that happen. "So you slipped Digitalis into his brandy," said Miss Marple softly. "You'd seen Dr. Ferris use it, and you knew how much would stop a heart without trace." Mrs. Hargreaves pressed her lips together. "He deserved it. He'd bled the family for years. And when Mrs. Kent suspected, you silenced her too. She was going to the police. She said she'd tell them everything. And Dr. Ferris." A shadow crossed the woman's face. "He found the will. Said it was forgery. Said he'd have to tell. I begged him not to. He laughed at me. So you staged his suicide." Mrs. Hargreaves' shoulders sagged. "I didn't mean to kill them all. I only meant to protect the Colonel." "He's a good man, Miss Marple. Weak, perhaps, but good." "And poor Nora," Miss Marple asked gently. "The girl was hysterical. I told her what to say, I thought. If she confessed, they'd stop digging. I never dreamed that she'd be hanged." Miss Marple's voice was soft but unflinching. "Evil rarely looks ahead, Mrs. Hargreaves. It only looks away." The woman broke down then, great sobs shaking her frame. "I only wanted to save him." "You destroyed him," said Miss Marple quietly, "and yourself as well." The inspector's confirmation when Graves heard the confession. He looked grim. "We'll take her into custody at once," he said, "though I doubt she'll live to see trial. Women like that, once the fight's gone, they fade." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but at least Nora will be spared. The law may still be merciful." The inspector regarded her thoughtfully. "You know, Miss Marple, I can't quite see how you guessed." She smiled. "Oh, it was nothing, really. The handkerchief, you see, Mrs. Kent's. It was washed and pressed, but the starch smelt faintly of lavender soap. The sort used only in the servants' quarters, and then there were the mementos. Mrs. Hargreaves always kept trinkets of those she loved. I found a box in her room full of old tokens. The Colonel's baby shoes, his school badges. It was all quite touching, and rather tragic." Graves nodded slowly. "You see everything, don't you?" "Not everything," said Miss Marple, "only enough. The Colonel's realization that evening, Miss Marple found Colonel Redmayne alone once more in the library. He looked older than his years, his uniform jacket hanging loosely, his eyes hollow. "They've taken her," he said quietly. "Hargreaves. My God, she's been with the family all her life. She loved you very much," said Miss Marple. "Love." He gave a bitter laugh. "She's destroyed us." "No," Miss Marple corrected softly. "You destroyed yourself long ago, when you let pride become your master. She merely carried it to its natural conclusion." He stared at her, then at the fire. "What will become of my wife? She will recover, I think. She acted foolishly, but not criminally. The will can be voided," the estate managed honestly. He said nothing for a long time. Then, almost inaudibly, "And Christmas." Miss Marple looked toward the unlit tree. "It will come, Colonel, as it always does. But not every house will welcome it." Romans 7. Miss Marple's reflection later, in her room, Miss Marple wrote a short letter to her friend Dolly Bantry, as was her custom after solving a case. "My dear Dolly, you will no doubt read of the Haverley affair in the papers. A dreadful business. 3 deaths and all on Christmas Eve. It began, as such things often do, with a lie told to spare another's feelings, and ended with blood on the snow. It strikes me again that wickedness often comes disguised as devotion. Mrs. Hargreaves was no common murderess. She was a woman who loved too blindly and too well. In St. Mary Mead, we should have said she was a bit too fond of the family. Alas, her fondness proved fatal. One learns, even at my age, that the line between loyalty and folly is thinner than one might wish. Still, there is comfort in seeing justice, gentle justice, done. Yours, affectionately, Jane Marple. She folded the letter neatly, sealing it with a touch of wax. Then she sat back and looked around the quiet room, the silver, backed brush upon the table, the ticking clock, the soft glow of the hearth. Outside, snowflakes drifted once more, fine and silent as dust. Somewhere below, a choir began to sing, "O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, her hands resting on her knitting. The warmth of the fire touched her face, and she thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that evil could dwell so comfortably among holly and hymnals. But then, she murmured, so can goodness, if one looks hard enough. Roman 8. The Christmas morning farewell. By the time Miss Marple descended the next morning, the house had fallen quiet. The police car had gone, leaving only a pair of deep tire tracks in the snow. Mrs. Redmayne, pale and composed, was in the hall, arranging a small vase of white chrysanthemums. "Miss Marple," she said faintly, "I hardly know how to thank you." "Please don't," said Miss Marple. "Truth is its own reward. Besides, I suspect you'll have need of kindness rather than gratitude in the days ahead. Will they hang her? I think not. The court will see her for what she is, a soul who mistook love for righteousness." Mrs. Redmayne nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Do you believe we'll ever be forgiven?" Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the morning light was breaking over the snow-draped lawns. "Christmas, my dear, is the season for forgiveness. You must simply learn to forgive yourselves." The woman reached out and squeezed her hand. "You are very kind." "Not kind," said Miss Marple with a faint smile, "merely observant." She stepped outside then, her small suitcase in hand. The village bells were ringing again, clear and full. She paused at the gate and turned back for one last look at Haverley Hall, its gables silvered with frost, its chimneys sending up soft curls of smoke. For all its grandeur, it looked now like a lonely house, emptied of laughter. Yet from one of the upper windows came a faint flicker of light. Take candle, perhaps, or a sign of hope. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer around her shoulders and began the walk toward the station. Her boots left crisp, neat prints in the snow, footsteps leading away from tragedy and toward the peace of St. Mary Mead, where the kettle would soon be boiling, and the world, for a little while at least, would feel safe again. The morning after the storm broke over Little Beechwood with a crisp frost that turned the hedgerows to glass. The air was brittle and thin, the kind that carried sound in sharp echoes. From the churchyard came the hollow tolling of bell, 9 times, slow and solemn. Inside the Frostmoor Manor drawing-room, the remnants of the previous night's chaos lingered. The great hearth burned low, casting a wavering light across Miss Marple's composed face as she sat in one of the high-backed armchairs. Opposite her were Inspector Craddock, Colonel Farnsworth, Lady Agatha, and the anxious vicar, Mr. Whitby. Doctor Pembroke stood by the sideboard, pouring himself yet another cup of coffee. Strong, black, and unnecessary. His hands trembled ever so slightly. The inspector had already sealed the house, barring the servants from leaving. All were present, as was the custom in such cases. Every suspect gathered before the quiet little lady who had somehow, with her lace collar and knitting bag, unpicked the threads of deception that had ensnared Frostmoor. Miss Marple cleared her throat delicately, the needles in her lap clicking to a halt. "My dear friends," she began gently, "it is never pleasant to speak of death, especially at Christmas time, when one expects joy and reconciliation rather than fear and suspicion. But alas, sin does not observe the calendar. The room was still. You see, she continued, I have long suspected that what we first thought to be a single, isolated act of violence was, in truth, a carefully staged sequence of crimes, each one meant to hide the true purpose behind them. Lady Agatha, pale and tight-lipped, whispered, Then you believe there was one hand behind all three? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not three separate hands, Lady Agatha, but one very clever one. And I dare say it took quite some time to prepare. Inspector Craddock leaned forward. We've been over the evidence, Miss Marple. The first, Mr. Hollies, poisoned. The second, poor Mrs. Danby, found at the foot of the stairs, likely pushed. And the third, our unfortunate Mr. Evers, shot in the library with his own revolver. Are you suggesting all three were murdered by the same person? Indeed I am, said Miss Marple calmly, and more to the point that all three deaths were linked by a common motive, one that is neither greed nor passion, but rather fear. Fear, echoed the vicar, bewildered. Yes, Mr. Whitby. The sort of fear that drives people to desperate measures to protect a secret they have long buried. She paused, letting the silence thicken. Outside, a flurry of snow brushed against the tall windows, a faint whisper like ghostly applause. I began to understand the pattern. She continued, when I realized the curious order in which the deaths occurred. Mr. Hollies, the butler, was the first to die. He had served this household faithfully for nearly 3 decades. A discreet man, but not without curiosity. He knew much about his employers, more than perhaps was wise. Then Mrs. Danby, the housekeeper, followed. She was fond of gossip, fond of knowing everyone's business. And finally Mr. Evers, the family solicitor, who, I might add, held the keys to certain documents no one else was meant to see. Miss Marple looked over her spectacles. Each of them, you see, held a piece of a puzzle, small, seemingly insignificant, until one saw the whole picture. Dr. Pembroke let out a brittle laugh. Surely, Miss Marple, you're not suggesting they were all silenced to keep some great secret from coming out? That is precisely what I am suggesting, she replied, unperturbed, though I might use a gentler term. I should say, someone wished to prevent a scandal. Lady Agatha gasped, clutching her handkerchief. A scandal? Here, in my house? Miss Marple inclined her head sympathetically. Yes, Lady Agatha. A scandal that began many years ago and has, unfortunately, reached its grim conclusion on this very Christmas Eve. She turned to Inspector Craddock. You will recall, Inspector, the torn letter found in the library fireplace. The one you thought to be the fragment of a personal note. Craddock nodded. Yes, it was mostly burnt. Only a few words legible. He knows. Can't risk it. Tonight, precisely, said Miss Marple, and though one might assume such a letter could be written by anyone, the handwriting, though smudged, was distinctively slanted to the left, with the lower loops unusually long. A trait, if you recall, shared by our esteemed village doctor. Dr. Pembroke stiffened. Are you accusing me of murder, Miss Marple? Oh, not directly, said Miss Marple with the faintest twinkle. Not yet, at least. But allow me to finish the tale. She leaned slightly forward, her voice taking on that calm, narrative rhythm that seemed to slow the heartbeat of every listener. The root of it all many years ago, in 1910, there was a tragedy connected to Frostmoor Manor. A small child, the illegitimate son of Lady Agatha's late husband, who was quietly sent away to a boarding institution under a false name. Few ever spoke of it. Society being what it was then, such things were hidden, not healed. Lady Agatha's lips trembled. How could you possibly know that? Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. A certain old nurse instant, Mary Mead, once served here as a parlour-maid in her youth. She mentioned a curious thing, the sudden dismissal of a maid named Alice, and a child never spoken of again. Such stories tend to stay in one's mind. The colour drained from Lady Agatha's face. "But what has that to do with murder?" asked the vicar. "Everything," said Miss Marple softly, "because that child, now a grown man, recently learned the truth of his birth. And he did not come to Frostmoor for reconciliation. He came for justice of a sort." Colonel Farnsworth frowned. "You mean blackmail?" "Not at first," said Miss Marple. "At first he merely sought recognition, perhaps even kindness. But when he found none, when he discovered that certain individuals knew and had profited from his silence, his intentions changed." She let her gaze rest briefly on Dr. Pembroke. "Mr. Evers, the solicitor, knew of the arrangement. He handled certain trust papers that ensured the young man's upkeep under another name. Hollis, the butler, discovered a letter confirming it, and Mrs. Danby, well, she overheard what she shouldn't have when she took tea in the servants' hall. There was a stunned pause. Lady Agatha murmured, then, all three of them knew. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and all three of them, in their own way, became threats to the man who stood to lose everything should that old secret become known." Craddock frowned. But who could that be? "The son himself." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Inspector. The opposite? The man who feared his exposure most of all. The one who would lose his good name, his career, and perhaps even his freedom if it were revealed he had falsified records to protect that secret for his own advantage." All eyes turned toward Dr. Pembroke. The doctor's face had gone white as the frost. "Outside, that's absurd," he whispered. "Utterly absurd." "Is it?" said Miss Marple mildly. "You see, when the child was sent away, he was given a new identity, and the only person who managed that arrangement was you, Doctor. You falsified the death certificate of a non-existent stillborn infant to cover Lady Agatha's embarrassment. In return, her late husband rewarded you handsomely. You rose quickly thereafter, did you not?" Dr. Pembroke's lips moved, but no sound came out. "When the young man returned to the village under the name Mr. Thomas Reed, a carpenter by trade, he approached you first, Doctor. He wanted to confirm what he had learned. But you, of course, denied it. And then, when he began speaking to the servants, you realized he might discover the truth through others. You acted swiftly." Inspector Craddock's expression hardened. "You mean to say, Doctor, Pembroke murdered 3 people to stop this secret from spreading?" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "He poisoned Hollis first using atropine extracted from his own medical supplies. Then, when Mrs. Danby hinted she knew more than she should, he staged her fall upon the staircase. Finally, he shot Mr. Evers when the man threatened to expose him after finding the same letter Mr. Reed had brought." "But what of Mr. Reed himself?" the vicar asked, shaken. "Was he aware of all this?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Mr. Reed never lived to see justice done. He died last winter in a railway accident near Bath, an event that, curiously, occurred just days after he visited Dr. Pembroke's practice." A murmur went through the room. The doctor's trembling hand dropped the coffee cup, which shattered upon the hearth. Miss Marple continued gently, "You see, Doctor, even the most careful men make mistakes. The bottle of atropine you used to poison Hollis bore the faint residue of your fingerprints beneath the label. I found it in the shrubbery near the servants' door, where you must have thrown it in haste when you heard Lady Agatha approaching that night. I also found, tucked inside your medical case, a note in Mr. Evers's handwriting, a request for a meeting before midnight, the very night he was killed. You could not bear to have him reveal the truth." Craddock rose from his chair, his voice grim. "Doctor Pembroke, I must ask you to come with me." The doctor said nothing. His shoulders slumped, his face hollowed of all colour. For a moment he looked less a villain than a man defeated by the long shadow of his own deceit. Lady Agatha turned her face away. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, aftermath later that afternoon, Frostmoor was a quiet house once more. The snow fell steadily outside, muffling the world in white. The police had departed with their prisoner, and Lady Agatha sat in the drawing-room, her eyes distant as she gazed into the fire. Miss Marple, having been persuaded to stay for tea, sat Betty